This first tip is so important, and so infrequently do people, when they're beginning to draw, actually do this. But it's to think, where do I want to end up in terms of my drawing? Where do I want to be in 6 months, 12 months? What is it about drawing that appeals to me that I want to be able to do at the end? Because how you progress will change according to the end point you want to reach. Do you want to draw architecture or nature? Do you want to draw cars? Do you want to do it in pencil or in pen or in charcoal or in something else? Do you want to trace them? Do you want to copy someone else's drawing? Do you want to draw in ink over pencil guidelines? Or do you want to be able to draw totally freehand in ink? Where do you want to end up? Because that will help you make the right choices. There are so many things with drawing we can do. Keeping where we want to end up in the short term is a great way of helping us to focus into those areas that will most benefit us for where we want to go. This second point flows on from that. If I want to draw in pencil, if that's a skill I want to develop, then I should start by drawing in pencil. But if I want to be able to draw in ink, to draw freehand directly in ink without any pencil, then starting off in pencil both takes up time I could be learning and improving in drawing with ink, but it also teaches me ways of thinking and techniques of putting and creating marks on the paper that actually are not helpful at all. So if you want to be able to draw in pencil, then as a beginner, focus on pencil. Don't draw with ink. If you want to be able to draw with ink, don't start with pencil. It's not a shortcut or easy way simply because you erase it to get into this. It's a different path that takes you to a different place. So if this is where you want to go, start with pen and start the challenge and the fun of drawing freehand. In a similar vein, we shouldn't trace over photos or trace over other people's drawings or copy other people's drawings if what we want to be able to do is to be able to see a scene in front of us or in a reference and to create a drawing from that, a drawing that no one else has done. Then tracing or copying other drawings will be a dead end for me because I won't be developing the skills that I need to develop to look at a reference and work out how do I put that on the paper. Number 3, you're going to say, yeah, I know that, but I know it from my experience drawing and a lot of the work of my drawing students that we don't think enough and we don't observe enough to be able to see what we're trying to capture. We're rushing to put lines and marks on the paper before we've really understood what we're looking at and worked out how we create that using whatever we're using. I think of drawing as similar to translating another language. We have something in one language, we have to put it in another language. And some of the things can be moved across fairly easily. Other things end up being more difficult and perhaps we have to create another way of saying what's being said here. If we don't look carefully enough, then we don't know what we're drawing and we're going to be misled into drawing what we think we've seen rather than what we've actually seen. We're often so keen to get to the end and have a drawing that we rush to start the actual ink on paper side of the drawing before we've observed and thought enough to have a chance of doing it, or at least a chance of doing it well. So don't rush to put the marks on paper. Point 4, again, flows on from the one before, but that's to highlight the fact that careful observation comes before we actually start to draw, before we actually put pen on the paper. A lot of the problems that we make, particularly as beginner drawers, we think comes from a lack of drawing skill, a lack of drawing technique, whereas in fact it's because we've underestimated the amount of observation we have to do to then have enough information in our minds to then be able to think about and work out how I'm going to present that, represent that on my paper. But if I haven't looked carefully to see exactly what this angle is like, I'm going to be tempted to just draw an approximate angle, possibly way too arched or flattened out. In Australia, carpenters have a phrase, measure twice, cut once. My personal take on that is observation 3 times Draw once. The sixth point is, don't be thinking, I'm learning to draw, I'm producing artworks, because that distracts us from the fact that we're learning to draw. And if we think of learning the piano, learning to play a sport, learning to drive a car, no one starts with everything they need to succeed. Everyone has to learn. It's exactly the same with drawing. One day you may well be producing artworks, but a better focus at the start is to keep reminding ourselves that we're learning to draw, and therefore we're often better off doing drawing exercises than trying to do completed drawings. So a helpful exercise to do would be to have our reference and not even be trying to draw it in terms of a finished drawing, but to work at drawing basic form and to get the perspective angles as correct as we can, to get the proportions of the various elements, this to that to this, as correct as we can, to get the size and proportion of the dome and the lantern on top as close as we can. We're not trying to put the detail on. We're only adding detail to see whether we've got the proportions correct in a few representative areas, which is a great way of checking whether our overall proportions are correct. Point 7, if we draw from photos, and the truth is that for most of us, most of the time, that's what's going to be happening. If we draw from photos, it's unhelpful to think that my end result is going to be to have something on my paper that looks as exactly the same as the photo as I possibly can do it. Photos have a lot of wonderful strengths, but they have a lot of weaknesses as well. And I intend to make a video on this soon, so I don't want to go into it here. But when our goal is to copy what we see as closely as possible, what we do is we capture all the weaknesses of the photo as well as hopefully its strengths. When I draw this as an artist, I'm creating, and I'm free to create what I think is going to be the best drawing. And beyond just capturing straight lines and architecture, I wanted to capture the feel of coziness, that this was a comfortable home. And so I used lines and marks and techniques to give a slight visual softness to this house. And in places, I simplified my reference to help the house stand out a bit more. If I think that representing the photo as accurately as possible is my aim, I'm going to stop myself from developing the thinking process patterns as well as the technical skills and the confidence to actually improve on my reference. Point number 8 is a personal favorite of mine. That's to stop thinking of drawing as being something that we do with lines. Now, of course, when we draw, we use lines. And what we usually do is we use lines to capture the objects, to run around the outside of the shapes of what we're looking at, and hopefully at the angle we're looking at it from. One of the problems of drawing with an emphasis on line and on outline is that it can create a cartoon-like effect, because if we think back to all our childhood cartoons, they are lines, basically outlines, in a highly simplified way. But if we don't think lines, if we think marks, even for a subject that has a lot of lines, then our thinking has changed from not doing lines that will define geometric shapes, but what marks will create in my drawing what I'm seeing in my reference. And if the sense in the reference photo is that these buildings are a lot further away than this building, then I want to try and capture that in the marks I use. And by thinking marks, it gets my focus on creating the effect of the scene, which goes beyond outline and drawing shapes. And this brings me to point 9, which is also personally a transformational way of thinking for my drawing. And that's to not try and draw the details that we see in a reference, but to try and draw the effect of the detail. I want to capture the fact that these objects down here are further away, and therefore in life we see them with less detail, less sharpness than we see the things closer. But if I'm thinking of capturing shape and outline, then I end up doing something more like this, which at best will be architecturally and from a perspective point of view accurate, But in the end, it does also capture this cartoon effect, rather than a sense of realism, that analysing the effect of what we see in our reference, working out what effect we want to create in our drawing, and then working out what marks, which of course includes what pens, will create that effect. The advantage of thinking drawing the effect of the detail rather than the detail can be seen in a scene such as this, where there is so much detail. If we're thinking of lines and outlines, how do we outline all of these shapes? How do we represent them? But if instead we think, what marks can I use to create the visual effect that I see there? Then it frees us up to find solutions that can give us not just a credible representation of the scene, but in its own right, a really interesting and compelling one. Point number 10 is, how long would you spend on an average drawing? And how many of those drawings do you complete in one session? This tip is that shorter, more frequent drawing sessions are better ways of learning any skill than longer ones that happen less frequently. If you've ever had piano lessons, you know that half an hour at practice a day will give better results than 4 hours practice on Saturday. This ties in well with point number 5 about not starting at the end, not starting with scenes that, while they really capture our attention, require a skill that we just can't achieve yet, but choosing simpler subjects that challenge us to use a lot of the same skills, but which we can start and finish in one session of 15 or 20 or 30 minutes. And then to do that more frequently will really accelerate our learning and our drawing improvement more than if we spend half a day once a week. And of course, this ties in nicely with thinking, I'm not going to be producing an artwork, I'm learning. If you're a beginner learning to draw, then I suspect you're also going to have to be your own teacher. There are more resources more easily available than ever before for most things, and that includes learning to draw. So many of us find ourselves being self-taught in that we get to choose what videos we watch, what materials we use, what subjects we draw, and how often we draw them. But just as careful observation of our reference at the start is so often not given the time it deserves, careful observation of our finished drawing is just as important, because it's actually the preparation for our next drawing. So I drew this little former railway station building, and the question is, and when I finished, I looked at it and thought, what am I happy with? Because critiquing is not just pointing out things that are wrong, it's pointing out things that have worked particularly well, because we want to make sure that we develop our skill with those. I got the perspective angles well positioned, I thought. I like this effect of the brickwork, capturing the effect, not drawing the actual detail. And while I liked how I drew the trees, they're simply too dark and the lines are too smooth and heavy in relation to the lines of the building. And so in some ways, the trees behind almost feel like they're closer. I wanted a certain amount of depth because that would highlight through negative space the form, the relatively simple form of the building. But I could have achieved this same darkness in the areas I needed it without having these heavy, overly black effect lines, marks for the tree canopies. And so in the next drawing that either had brickwork at this sort of really quite small scale, or where I had trees in the background, my critiquing let me focus in helpful ways, both of developing the good and eradicating the less helpful. And point 12 is, don't forget to experiment. When so much of the time we're finding a reference, very often the focus is on trying to reproduce what's in our reference. But with different aspects of drawing, depending what subjects we draw, it can be really important, really helpful to experiment, to try different things and compare the results. So I drew this scene and I applied sketch marker to highlight the lights and darks. But before I put the sketch marker on top, I took a photo of the line work and I printed off a few copies of just the line work. What this lets me do is it lets me experiment with different values, darker values or lighter values, or just some values darker, and work out which one do I like, which one actually captures the effect of my reference better. And of course, we're not having to be precious with our drawings because we don't want to wreck them because they're artworks. But what we're doing when we're learning to draw is we're learning to draw. I think a far more helpful way to think is along the lines of, I'm not producing artworks, I'm doing drawing exercises. And drawing exercises, by definition, are really just a part of a bigger whole. They're a subset of skill or of learning, of knowledge that we're acquiring. And by doing something such as this, we can fast track being able to just concentrate on the element of the drawing process that we're particularly trying to learn at that point. So in wanting to focus on applying value, applying lights and darks, we don't have to keep redrawing the line work, which takes a lot longer than applying the values. And therefore we can achieve more experimentation here. When we start, we're starting a journey, we're doing our best, we're dragging along with it a whole lot of thoughts, memories, expectations, misunderstandings about drawing, childhood memories. But wherever we start, we start. But learning to draw is a learning process. And I believe these 12 points really will fast track our journey through that learning process by giving us the mindset we need to succeed in what we personally are trying to achieve through our drawing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, as always, I hope this has been helpful. And if you are a beginner, I do have a couple of playlists that have more straightforward, smaller subjects. And for all my drawing videos, the reference photo is on my channel community page if you want to have a go drawing it yourself. So you don't even have to spend time trying to find something to draw. If you have a shortcut to my channel community page, you can get right into it straight away. But look, whatever you're drawing, however you're drawing it, whatever level you're at, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.